Winning became a state project. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire country decides that winning matters more than truth? For decades, the Winter Olympics have represented the purest ideals of sport. Human limits tested on ice and snow, nations competing under shared rules, medals earned through discipline and sacrifice. But behind the pageantry, behind the anthems and podium smiles, a darker system was quietly at work. This is the story of alleged state-backed doping cover-ups, not driven by rogue athletes, but by governments, laboratories, and officials who turned cheating into policy. At the center of the scandal stood Russia. Whispers began long before the world paid attention. Unusual medal surges, athletes peaking at impossible moments, tests that vanished, positive results quietly rewritten. For years, suspicions floated through international sports circles, dismissed as politics or jealousy. Then came the evidence. According to multiple investigations, including findings that would later rock the Olympic movement, Russia had allegedly built a systemic doping program that extended far beyond individual athletes. Coaches, doctors, lab technicians, and sports officials were accused of working together to administer performance-enhancing drugs, and then erase the proof. This wasn't about one skier or one skater. This was about infrastructure. At the heart of the allegations was the manipulation of drug testing laboratories. Urine samples that tested positive were reportedly swapped, altered, or destroyed. Clean samples were secretly stored in advance. Athletes were allegedly coached not only on how to dope, but how to avoid detection. And when detection did happen, the system allegedly kicked in. Positive tests were buried. Paperwork disappeared. Athletes were allowed to compete anyway. The Winter Olympics, where milliseconds decide legacies, became a battlefield where chemistry and secrecy mattered as much as training. For the athletes, the situation was impossible. Some knowingly participated, understanding that refusal could end careers, funding, or safety. Others later claimed they were coerced, misled, or never fully informed. Young competitors chasing lifelong dreams suddenly found themselves trapped between obedience and conscience. Win and become a national hero. Refuse and disappear. The alleged cover-ups didn't just distort competition. They rewrote history. Clean athletes from other countries lost medals, opportunities, endorsements, and careers. Years later, some would receive Olympic medals in quiet ceremonies, long after the cameras had moved on, long after the moment had passed. Gold turned to silver, silver turned to nothing, and for many, justice arrived too late to matter. What made this scandal uniquely disturbing wasn't just the doping. It was the organization behind it. This wasn't an underground ring. It was allegedly woven into national pride. Olympic success became proof of strength, resilience, and superiority on the global stage. Losing wasn't just failure, it was embarrassment. And embarrassment, according to investigators, was unacceptable. As suspicions escalated, international authorities began digging deeper. Whistleblowers emerged. Former insiders described secret labs, late-night sample swaps, and coded language used to disguise violations. What they described wasn't chaos, it was procedure. By the time the world truly grasped the scope of the allegations, the damage was already done. Medals had been awarded, records had been broken, careers had been shaped by results that were now under question. And the Winter Olympics, once seen as untouchable, were forced to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the biggest crime in Olympic history wasn't committed by athletes, but by the system meant to protect fair play? Because once cheating becomes institutional, truth doesn't just get hidden, it gets redesigned. And as investigations moved forward, the consequences would prove uneven, falling hardest on individuals, while the machinery behind them struggled to face real accountability. That imbalance is where this story truly begins, when the lies became too big to contain. For years, the allegations surrounding Russian Winter Olympic athletes existed in a gray zone, spoken in whispers, buried in reports, and dismissed as political noise. Winning breeds resentment, officials argued. Accusations were easy to make, hard to prove. But suspicion has a way of accumulating. And eventually, it reached a breaking point. The first cracks didn't come from rival nations or Olympic committees. They came from inside the system itself. Unusual patterns no one could ignore. Anti-doping agencies began noticing anomalies that couldn't be explained by coincidence. Russian athletes were testing positive at unusually high rates outside of major competitions, then suddenly appearing clean when it mattered most. Samples that should have triggered bans were quietly reclassified as technical errors. Reports went missing. Appeals were resolved with remarkable speed. To outside observers, it looked less like randomness and more like choreography. Athletes would dominate at world championships, disappear under suspicion, then return stronger than before. Entire teams improved simultaneously, often beyond historical norms. And when questions were raised, the answers were vague, bureaucratic, and evasive. Still, suspicion alone wasn't enough. The Olympic movement required proof. The whistleblowers stepped forward. That proof began to surface when former Russian anti-doping officials and athletes started talking. Some spoke anonymously. Others went public at enormous personal risk. They described a system where doping wasn't hidden, it was managed. Where athletes were given banned substances as part of training regimens, then reassured that the state would handle the tests. Where refusal wasn't framed as an option. Most chilling were the descriptions of laboratory manipulation. According to whistleblower accounts, urine samples were secretly swapped through hidden openings in laboratory walls. Clean samples, collected months earlier, were stored and reinserted when athletes tested positive. Bottles designed to be tamper-proof were allegedly opened, altered, and resealed under cover of night. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was allegedly supervised. And it appeared to work. The turning point. The world's attention snapped into focus when international investigators were granted access to evidence previously kept out of reach. Independent reports painted a picture far darker than anyone had publicly acknowledged. What emerged was not a handful of cheaters, but a state-supported ecosystem designed to protect medals at all costs. The findings suggested coordination between sports ministries, national Olympic committees, anti-doping laboratories, coaches, and medical staff. In other words, the very institutions meant to enforce fairness were allegedly helping to destroy it. That realization changed everything. The narrative shifted from athletes cheating to a country engineering outcomes. Athletes caught in the middle. As suspicion grew, so did the human cost. Some athletes admitted they had doped willingly, believing it was the price of success. Others claimed they were minors at the time, trusting doctors and coaches who assured them everything was legal. Some insisted they never knowingly violated rules, but were implicated by a system that no longer distinguished innocence from obedience. For many, speaking out meant exile from teams, funding, and their homeland. Remaining silent meant carrying medals that now felt radioactive. Every podium appearance became suspect. Every national anthem played carried an unspoken question. Was this earned or engineered? The international fallout. As evidence mounted, international pressure became unavoidable. Olympic committees debated bans. Anti-doping agencies demanded sanctions. Sponsors grew nervous, but enforcement proved complicated. Punishing individual athletes felt insufficient. Punishing an entire nation risked political fallout. And unraveling years of results threatened the credibility of the Olympics themselves. So the world hesitated. In that hesitation, suspicion deepened. Clean athletes demanded justice. Former medalists learned, years later, that they should have stood on the podium. Careers had been altered permanently. Opportunities lost to performances now deemed illegitimate. And still, the full scope of responsibility remained unclear. Who ordered the cover-ups? Who approved the lab manipulation? Who benefited most from silence? Those questions hung unanswered as investigations continued. But one thing was no longer in doubt. This was no longer about testing positive. It was about truth being systematically erased. and about how difficult it is to restore fairness once deception becomes institutional. As the world braced for consequences, one final phase remained: the evidence itself. And what it would reveal would shake the Olympic movement to its core. Inside the labs, the files, and the proof that changed everything. Suspicion alone does not collapse systems. Evidence does. And in the case of alleged Russian Winter Olympics doping cover-ups, the evidence didn't arrive all at once. It emerged slowly, methodically, and with devastating clarity, each piece reinforcing the last until denial became impossible. This was no longer rumor. This was documentation. The laboratory that wasn't what it seemed. At the center of the scandal stood the Moscow Anti-Doping Laboratory, a facility officially certified to uphold international standards. On paper, it was a guardian of clean sport. In reality, investigators alleged it functioned as the opposite. According to independent reports, the lab had been transformed into a filtering system. Positive tests from Russian athletes were not automatically reported to international authorities. Instead, they were flagged internally, reviewed by officials, and, when necessary, made to disappear. Emails, logs, and databases revealed a disturbing pattern. Positive results marked as save, to be hidden. Negative results marked as quarantine, to be reported later. Entire test results erased from records. This was not accidental mismanagement. It was procedural. The sample swapping operation. The most shocking evidence involved the alleged physical manipulation of urine samples. Olympic drug testing bottles are designed to be tamper-proof. Once sealed, they should not reopen without visible damage. Yet investigators found bottles that showed signs of opening and resealing without obvious breakage. Whistleblowers described a clandestine method. Athletes provided clean urine samples months in advance. These samples were frozen and cataloged. During major competitions, positive samples were secretly swapped with clean ones. Some accounts described hidden wall openings in laboratory rooms, allowing samples to be passed in and out under cover of darkness. The imagery was surreal, almost cinematic, but forensic testing supported the claims. Salt levels, DNA inconsistencies, and microscopic damage to bottle caps told a story the paperwork denied. Independent investigations step in. As trust in internal systems collapsed, independent bodies took over. Investigators cross-referenced sample IDs, chain of custody records, athlete biological passports, lab staff testimony. The findings were damning. Patterns emerged showing that athletes who should have tested positive during Olympic cycles were inexplicably cleared, while those outside major events were not afforded the same protection. The implication was unavoidable. The cover-ups were timed. The biological passport evidence. Perhaps the most scientifically compelling evidence came from athlete biological passports, long-term profiles tracking biomarkers over time. These passports don't look for specific drugs. They look for impossible physiological changes. In multiple cases, Russian athletes showed extreme fluctuations consistent with doping, followed by sudden normalization during Olympic testing windows. The odds of these changes occurring naturally were statistically negligible. When combined with lab manipulation evidence, the passports functioned like fingerprints left at the crime scene. The medals that didn't belong to who held them. As evidence mounted, Olympic authorities began the painful process of retesting stored samples from previous Winter Games. The results rewrote history. Athletes who had stood on podiums were stripped of medals years later. Clean competitors from other nations were retroactively elevated, but often without ceremonies, without crowds, without recognition. Gold medals were mailed. Anthems were never replayed. Moments were gone forever. The evidence proved cheating, but justice arrived too late to restore what mattered most. Denial, deflection, and delay. Russian officials denied systemic wrongdoing. They argued that investigations were biased, politically motivated, and exaggerated. Individual athletes insisted they were victims of a corrupt system or victims of false accusations. Some cases were appealed. Others were overturned on technicalities. Enforcement became uneven, fragmented, and controversial. And that exposed another uncomfortable truth. Even overwhelming evidence struggles to prevail when accountability threatens powerful institutions. What the evidence ultimately proved. The evidence did not prove that every Russian athlete doped. It did not prove that every medal was stolen. But it did prove something far more consequential. It proved that the testing system had been compromised. Results could not be trusted. Fair competition had been knowingly undermined. The Olympic ideal depends on belief that rules are enforced equally. Once that belief is broken, evidence doesn't just expose crime, it exposes fragility. And as the world absorbed the findings, the final question became unavoidable. Who would actually pay the price for a system this big? Because historically, systems don't go to prison. People do. And the reckoning, uneven and controversial, was just beginning. Punishments, power, and the illusion of justice. Once the evidence became undeniable, the world expected consequences. What followed instead was something far more complicated. Investigations into Russia's alleged state-backed doping program triggered sanctions, hearings, appeals, reversals, and political pressure that stretched across years. Justice did arrive, but unevenly, selectively, and often too late to feel complete. This was not a clean reckoning. It was a negotiated one. The bans that shook the Olympics. The International Olympic Committee, IOC, faced a dilemma it had never truly prepared for. How do you punish a system without destroying the games themselves? Their answer was historic and controversial. Russia was officially banned from multiple Olympic Games, including the Winter Olympics. But the ban came with conditions. Instead of a full exclusion, Russian flags were removed. The national anthem was banned. The country name was replaced with neutral designations. Athletes competed under labels like Olympic athlete from Russia, ROC, Russian Olympic Committee. To the public, it looked like punishment. To critics, it looked like rebranding. Athletes caught in the crossfire. For individual athletes, the impact was deeply personal. Some were banned outright after retesting confirmed doping violations. Careers ended overnight. Medals were stripped years after they were won. Public reputations collapsed, often without the chance to compete again to prove innocence or redemption. Others, however, were cleared to compete under neutrality rules, claiming they had never doped and were victims of a corrupted system. This split created a moral gray zone. Were clean athletes being punished for crimes they didn't commit? Or were guilty athletes being protected by procedural loopholes? The answer depended on which case you examined and who was asking. Officials, rarely seen, rarely sentenced. While athletes bore the public consequences, attention turned to those accused of orchestrating the system. Coaches, lab directors, and sports officials were named in reports. Some lost positions. Others vanished quietly from public roles. But criminal accountability was scarce. Very few officials faced prison sentences. Even fewer faced international prosecution. Jurisdictional limits, political resistance, and the absence of unified enforcement mechanisms meant that responsibility diffused upward and then disappeared. The architects of the system largely avoided the punishment imposed on the athletes who competed within it. Appeals, reversals, and legal chaos. Sanctions were challenged aggressively. At the Court of Arbitration for Sport, CAS, multiple bans were reduced or overturned. Some athletes regained eligibility. Others had sanctions shortened due to procedural flaws rather than factual innocence. Each ruling added confusion. Was the system proven corrupt or not? Were sanctions symbolic or enforceable? Did legal technicalities outweigh ethical violations? To many observers, justice appeared fragile, dependent on paperwork rather than truth. The medal table that changed quietly. As investigations concluded, Olympic results were rewritten. Medals were reassigned years later. Standings changed long after the cameras were gone. Clean athletes from other nations were declared winners retroactively. But there were no podiums, no anthems, no crowds. Victory arrived by email or courier package. For many athletes, the correction felt hollow. Their moment, earned through years of training, had already been stolen. Global fallout beyond Russia. The impact rippled outward. Anti-doping agencies tightened oversight. Testing protocols were redesigned. Laboratories faced stricter scrutiny. Whistleblower protections were expanded, on paper. But skepticism lingered. Fans questioned results. Athletes questioned fairness. Every exceptional performance carried a shadow of doubt. The Olympics survived, but innocence did not fully recover. A system punished, a message sent, or was it? Officially, the investigations were declared a success. The system was exposed. Sanctions were imposed. Reforms were announced. Unofficially, the outcome told a more uncomfortable story. Powerful institutions can absorb scandal. Athletes cannot. The punishment fell hardest on individuals, especially those least equipped to defend themselves legally or politically. And that leaves one final, unresolved tension at the heart of the scandal. If justice is selective, does it still deter future abuse? Because when consequences feel negotiable, systems don't change. They adapt. When winning becomes the only truth. Long after the investigations ended, after sanctions were negotiated and medals quietly reassigned, one question refused to disappear. What did this scandal permanently change? Because the Russian doping controversy wasn't just about banned substances or corrupted labs. It exposed something far deeper and far more uncomfortable about modern sport nationalism and the price of winning on the world's biggest stage. The end of innocence in Olympic performance. For decades, the Olympics sold a powerful myth that the Games were a pure contest of human excellence, where politics stopped at the arena doors. That myth shattered. After the revelations, no extraordinary performance could be watched without suspicion. Record-breaking times, unbelievable endurance, miraculous recoveries. All of it now came with an unspoken question. How much of this is real? Fans didn't stop loving the Olympics, but trust became conditional. Every medal ceremony felt slightly hollow. Every national celebration carried an asterisk. The scandal didn't just taint one country. It permanently altered how greatness itself is perceived. Sport as soft power and the cost of weaponizing it. At its core, this was a story about power. Olympic success isn't just about medals. It's about global prestige, political legitimacy, national identity broadcast to billions. In that context, athletes become more than competitors, they become symbols. The scandal showed what happens when a nation treats sport as a geopolitical weapon. Winning becomes mandatory. Failure becomes unacceptable. Ethics become negotiable. Athletes weren't just encouraged to succeed, they were expected to deliver national pride, regardless of the personal cost. And when that pressure meets opportunity, systems bend. The athlete's dilemma, choice or coercion, one of the most haunting moral questions, remains unresolved. How much choice did the athletes really have? Some knowingly doped, some suspected but didn't ask questions. Some may have been completely unaware. But in a system where coaches control careers, officials control testing, refusal can mean exclusion. Consent becomes complicated. The scandal forces viewers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Not every rule breaker is a villain, and not every medalist is a hero. Many athletes were trapped between ambition and survival. Justice delayed is justice distorted. Years after the Games, medals were redistributed. Careers were reassessed, legacies rewritten, but time diluted accountability. The emotional damage to clean athletes who lost podium moments, sponsorships, and recognition was irreversible. You cannot recreate the roar of a crowd years later. You cannot retroactively restore opportunity. The moral lesson was brutal. Even when the truth comes out, it doesn't arrive equally for everyone. Can sport ever be truly clean again? The reforms that followed promised a new era. Stronger testing, independent oversight, whistleblower protections. But skepticism lingers. Because systems that once hid wrongdoing don't disappear, they evolve. The scandal taught the world that cheating doesn't always look reckless or desperate. Sometimes it looks organized, bureaucratic, and quietly efficient. And that realization permanently changed the relationship between fans and the spectacle. Why this story still matters. This wasn't just an Olympic scandal. It was a warning about what happens when winning outweighs well-being. National pride overrides personal ethics. Institutions protect reputations instead of people. The Russian doping revelations didn't end corruption in sport, but they made denial impossible. And perhaps that is the most lasting legacy. The final question that haunts every games. As the Olympic flame continues to be lit, as new athletes rise and records fall, one question now lives beneath every broadcast. What are we willing to ignore in exchange for greatness? Because when the pursuit of victory becomes absolute, the line between excellence and exploitation disappears. And once that line is gone, sport stops being a celebration of humanity and becomes a mirror of its flaws.